The wooden pontoon exploded into splinters just 10 feet ahead of the wingtip. Lieutenant Robert Ellis yanked the stick hard left, the Stinson L-5 Sentinel groaning as it skidded sideways through humid air barely 30 feet above Irrawaddy River. Japanese rifle fire stitched the water below in white foam lines. His observer, Corporal Jimmy Nakamura, screamed something lost in the roar of wind and engine. Ellis didn't need translation. He could see it himself. 11 sampans and barges clustered near the eastern bank, decks loaded with crates, fuel drums, and at least 60 Japanese soldiers. No fighter cover. No bomber squadron. Just him, a fabric-skinned observation plane everyone called a toy, and a single idea so insane it might actually work. He shoved the throttle forward, aiming the Sentinel's nose straight at the lead barge. Behind him, in the tiny rear cockpit, Nakamura armed the last 2 improvised phosphorus grenades. Ellis felt the sweat freeze on his neck, despite the heat. This was the 12th run in 3 days. The other pilots had stopped laughing, but they still wouldn't join him. If you believe stories like this shouldn't vanish with time, subscribe. Let's keep their memory alive together. Robert Thomas Ellis was born in a dusty corner of West Texas in 1918. The fourth son of a cattle rancher who'd lost everything twice before Ellis turned 10. The boy grew up watching his father rebuild from nothing, learning that survival wasn't about strength or luck, but about seeing angles nobody else noticed. While other kids played baseball, Ellis spent afternoons at the local airstrip, sweeping hangars in exchange for rides in rattling biplanes. He soloed at 16, earned a civilian license at 17, and enlisted in the Army Air Corps 3 months after Pearl Harbor. His instructors noted his excellent spatial sense, but flagged him for one persistent problem. He refused to follow doctrine when he thought he saw a better way. In training, Ellis once aborted a formation bombing run to drop his payload on a secondary target he'd spotted through a gap in clouds. He was right. The secondary target turned out to be more valuable. He was also reprimanded. The Air Corps didn't reward improvisation. They rewarded discipline. Ellis learned to keep his mouth shut, but he never stopped looking for angles. By the spring of 1944, the Burma campaign had devolved into a grinding nightmare of jungle disease and logistical collapse. The Japanese controlled the river networks, using them to move troops, ammunition, and rice under cover of thick canopy and monsoon fog. Allied bombers couldn't hit individual boats, and fighter bombers rarely wasted fuel on such small, scattered targets. The result was a slow hemorrhage of Allied positions as Japanese reinforcements flowed freely through the waterways. Ellis, freshly arrived in theater and assigned to the 2nd Air Commando Group, flew reconnaissance missions in the Stinson L-5 Sentinel, an unarmed 2-seat observation plane built for spotting artillery and ferrying officers. The Sentinel was slow, fragile, and completely outmatched by any combat aircraft. Pilots joked that you could shoot one down with a good rifle. Ellis didn't laugh. He saw something else. The Sentinel could fly low, slow, and turn inside its own wingspan. It could land on dirt roads and take off in 300 feet. And most importantly, it could get under the Japanese radar. During his 6th reconnaissance flight, Ellis spotted a convoy of 8 sampans moving south along a narrow tributary of the Chindwin River. He circled twice, took photographs, and radioed the coordinates to base. 3 days later, he overflew the same area. The convoy was still there, reinforced by additional boats. No strike had been ordered. When Ellis returned and asked why, the operations officer shrugged. No available bombers, no fighters to spare, not enough value in the target. Ellis argued that those boats were resupplying an entire Japanese battalion. The operations officer told him to stick to reconnaissance. That night, Ellis sat on the wing of his Sentinel, staring at the jungle canopy under a moonless sky, and made a decision that would either end his career or change the war. He was going to arm the toy plane. The problem was munitions. The Sentinel had no hard points, no bomb racks, no weapon mount of any kind. It was never designed to carry ordnance. But Ellis had learned something critical during his teenage years at that Texas airstrip. Planes were just machines, and machines to be modified if you understood load, balance, and risk. He recruited Corporal Nakamura, a Nisei translator and intelligence specialist who'd flown with him twice and shared his frustration over inactive targets. Together, they began scavenging materials. From a field engineering unit, they acquired thermite grenades and white phosphorus canisters. From a wrecked British cargo plane, they pulled a rack of smoke markers. From their own survival kits, they took flares. Ellis calculated weight distribution, tested release mechanisms using rope and scrap metal, and mounted crude shackles beneath the Sentinel's rear fuselage and wing struts. The modifications were invisible from more than 50 feet away. Nobody noticed because nobody cared what a liaison pilot did with his toy. On May 12, 1944, at 0540 hours, Ellis took off from a dirt strip near Impo without filing a proper flight plan. Nakamura sat in back, lap filled with grenades. Their target was the same convoy Ellis had reported days earlier. The flight took 38 minutes, skimming treetops to avoid detection. When they reached the tributary, Ellis saw not 8 but 13 boats, several equipped with deck-mounted machine guns. His pulse hammered, but his hands stayed steady. He dropped to 40 feet, throttled back to just above stall speed, and lined up on the lead sampan. Nakamura pulled the pin on a thermite grenade, counted 2 seconds, and dropped it over the side. It hit the bow, bounced once, and ignited. White-hot chemical fire erupted across the deck, spreading faster than water could suppress it. Japanese soldiers leapt overboard. Ellis banked hard right, circled, and came back for the second boat. The next pass was uglier. The Japanese were ready. Rifle fire punched through the Sentinel's fabric skin in a dozen places. One round shattered the compass. Another creased Ellis's left eye, drawing blood but missing bone. He didn't feel it until later. Nakamura dropped another grenade. This one missed, exploding in the water 5 feet short and showering the boat with burning phosphorus fragments. Enough. The sampan's cargo, likely ammunition, detonated in a secondary blast that flipped the vessel and sent debris 300 feet into the air. Ellis pulled up hard, cleared the treeline, and swung back around. 11 boats left. They made 4 more passes in the next 18 minutes. Each run brought heavier fire. Ellis flew so low that Nakamura could see the expressions on enemy faces. A machine gun on the 4th boat nearly shredded the Sentinel's tail. Ellis compensated by approaching from downstream, using the current's direction to predict movement and drop ordnance ahead of the target. It worked. The 4th, 5th, and 6th boats caught fire or capsized. Japanese soldiers abandoned the remaining vessels, fleeing into jungle or clinging to half-submerged wreckage. Ellis counted his remaining munitions: 3 grenades, 2 phosphorus markers, 1 flare. He made a final pass, dropping everything on the 2 largest barges. Both erupted in flame. Then he turned north and flew home. When Ellis landed back at Impo, his Sentinel looked like it had flown through a sawmill. Fabric hung in strips. The tail showed 4 bullet holes, and the left strut was cracked. Nakamura climbed out pale and shaking, vomited beside the wing, and then started laughing. Ellis said nothing. He taxied to the maintenance area, shut down the engine, and walked directly to the operations tent. The duty officer stared at him, taking in the bloodstained flight suit and shredded aircraft. Ellis placed a handwritten list on the desk: location, time, number of vessels destroyed or damaged, estimated enemy casualties. The duty officer read it twice. Then he asked if Ellis had lost his mind. Ellis replied that he'd lost patience, not his mind, and requested permission to repeat the mission tomorrow. Word spread. By noon, half the squadron had walked past Ellis's Sentinel to see the damage. Some pilots shook their heads. Others muttered about court-martials. A few asked questions. Ellis explained his method: low altitude, slow speed, tight turns, improvised ordnance, and the element of shock. The Sentinel was too small and too slow for Japanese gunners trained to track fighters. It didn't behave like a threat, so defenses reacted late. And once fire started on a wooden boat loaded with ammunition or fuel, the target destroyed itself. The operations officer, after consulting with higher command, issued an unofficial green light. Ellis could continue, but only as an experiment, with no formal support and no promise of backup if things went wrong. Ellis agreed. He didn't want backup. Backup would slow him down. Over the next 2 weeks, Ellis flew 9 more solo attack missions, each targeting river convoys identified during reconnaissance. Nakamura accompanied him on 7. On 2 flights, Ellis went alone, dropping ordnance by releasing a rope-triggered shackle with his left hand while flying with his right. The results were devastating. By May 26th, Ellis had personally sunk or disabled 23 Japanese vessels, killed an estimated 140 enemy soldiers, and destroyed tons of ammunition, rice, and medical supplies. Japanese river traffic in the sector slowed to a trickle. Intelligence reports noted increased enemy radio chatter, expressing confusion and frustration over phantom attacks by an unidentified aircraft. One intercepted message described the attacker as a small demon plane that strikes from the trees. Ellis's commanding officer began receiving inquiries from Allied headquarters. Was there a new ground attack squadron operating in the area? Where were these reports coming from? The truth came out when a British liaison officer visited Imphal and witnessed Ellis's return from a mission. The Sentinel was so badly shot up that Ellis had to land with partial control failure, skidding sideways to a stop 50 feet short of the strip. The British officer demanded an explanation. Ellis provided one, along with photographs, mission logs, and a tally of destroyed targets. The officer forwarded everything up the chain. Within a week, Ellis was summoned to a briefing with a colonel he'd never met. He expected a reprimand. Instead, the colonel asked if Ellis could train others. Ellis said yes, but only if they understood the risk. The Sentinel wasn't armored. It wasn't fast. One well-aimed burst from a heavy machine gun would end everything. You had to fly low enough to see faces, close enough to feel heat from your own explosions, and steady enough to place ordnance within a 10-foot margin. Most pilots couldn't do it, not because they lacked skill, but because every instinct screamed to climb, to gain altitude, to get away from the ground. Ellis had learned to ignore those instincts. 3 pilots volunteered to try. Ellis took each one up as an observer, flying attack runs on dummy targets, and then live missions against isolated boats. 2 of the 3 washed out after a single combat sortie, shaken by the intensity of ground fire and the margin-less flying. The third, a lieutenant named Paul Grayson, stuck with it and eventually sank 4 boats on his own. But Grayson flew with visible tension, muscle-locked and reactive. Ellis flew loose, reading the air and the river like a language. He didn't just attack boats. He studied them. He noticed how Japanese cruise position machine guns, how they reacted to engine noise, how they scattered when hit. He adjusted his approach angles, diversified his ordnance, and began using white phosphorus not just for destruction, but for psychological effect. Phosphorus created smoke and terror. Boats that weren't even hit would sometimes be abandoned when crews saw the white cloud spreading across the water. Ellis exploited that. He learned to maximize panic and minimize his own exposure. On June 3rd, Ellis flew his most audacious mission. Intelligence reported a Japanese supply depot hidden along a tributary near Mall Lake, protected by dense jungle and considered unreachable by conventional air attack. The depot stored fuel, ammunition, and replacement equipment for 3 infantry battalions. Allied command wanted it destroyed, but had no assets available. Ellis volunteered. He took off at dawn with Nakamura and a modified payload, 6 thermite grenades for phosphorus canisters, and 2 experimental incendiary clusters built by field engineers. The flight required 90 minutes of navigation through unmapped valleys and over ridgelines that scraped the Sentinel's wheels. When they found the depot, it was larger than expected. 23 structures, multiple storage bunkers, at least 100 personnel, and 4 heavy machine guns positioned on elevated platforms. Ellis didn't hesitate. He came in from the east with the rising sun behind him, blinding the gunners. The first pass hit a fuel dump. The explosion was so massive it rocked the Sentinel in midair, nearly flipping it. Ellis fought for control, leveled out, and turned back. Nakamura dropped the incendiary clusters on 2 storage buildings. Both ignited. Japanese soldiers ran in every direction. The machine guns opened up, but Ellis was already past them, skimming the river, weaving between sandbars. He made 3 more passes, each one targeting a different section of the depot. By the time he turned for home, the entire complex was burning. Smoke rose 3,000 feet. Allied observation posts 50 miles away saw the column and radioed to ask what had happened. Ellis didn't answer until he landed. Then he simply reported target destroyed. The success at Maulake earned Ellis a commendation and a promotion to captain. It also brought unwanted attention. Staff officers arrived asking questions about tactics, ordnance types, and scalability. Could this method be formalized? Could other liaison squadrons adopt it? Ellis tried to explain that the tactic worked because it was irregular, unexpected, and executed by someone willing to accept insane risk. Turn it into doctrine, and the Japanese would adapt. Add more planes, and you'd lose the element of surprise. The officers nodded politely and began drafting reports anyway. Ellis returned to flying. He didn't care about doctrine. He cared about results. By mid-June, Ellis had flown 21 solo attack missions. His official tally, confirmed by reconnaissance and intelligence reports, stood at 37 vessels destroyed or disabled, 2 supply depots obliterated, and estimated enemy casualties exceeding 200. Japanese forces in the sector began avoiding river travel during daylight hours, shifting to night movement, and splitting convoys into smaller, harder-to-detect groups. The shift slowed their logistics significantly, buying Allied ground forces critical time to consolidate positions. Yet outside his squadron, few people knew Ellis's name. The missions were classified due to their unconventional nature, and higher command worried that publicizing them would invite Japanese countermeasures or criticism from Allied air commanders who still viewed liaison aircraft as non-combat assets. Ellis didn't care about recognition. He cared that the boat stopped moving. On June 19th, Ellis took off on what would be his final mission of the campaign. The target was a heavily defended convoy near Kiowa. 11 boats, including 2 armored barges, equipped with dual machine guns. Intelligence considered it too dangerous for a solo Sentinel strike and recommended waiting for fighter-bomber support. Ellis ignored the recommendation. He flew out at dawn with Nakamura, carrying a full load of thermite and phosphorus. They reached the convoy at 06:15, just as morning fog began lifting from the water. Ellis attacked immediately, hitting the lead armored barge before its guns could traverse. The thermite grenade landed perfectly, igniting ammunition stored on deck. The barge exploded, taking 2 nearby sampans with it. Ellis pulled up, circled, and dove again. This time the Japanese were ready. Both remaining machine guns locked onto him, converging fire that tore through the Sentinel's wing and fuselage. Nakamura was hit in the shoulder. Ellis took shrapnel in his right arm, but kept flying. He made 4 more passes, dropping every piece of ordnance he had. When it was over, 8 of the 11 boats were burning or sinking. The remaining 3 had beached and been abandoned. Ellis turned north, bleeding, engine coughing, and flew 73 miles back to base on willpower and fumes. He landed hard, blowing both tires and bending the landing gear. Medics pulled Nakamura out first, then Ellis, who refused a stretcher and walked to the debriefing tent under his own power. He filed his report, accepted medical treatment for shrapnel wounds, and was grounded for 2 weeks. During his recovery, the squadron received orders to rotate back to India for rest and refit. Ellis's missions ended not with ceremony or fanfare, but with a quiet order reassigning him to staff duties in Calcutta. He protested, arguing he was fit to return to combat. The protests were ignored. By July, he was gone from the front, his Sentinel scrapped for parts, his tactics filed away in classified reports that few would ever read. The final tally, compiled from mission logs, intelligence assessments, and post-war records, confirmed that Captain Robert Ellis, flying an unarmed observation aircraft modified with improvised weapons, personally destroyed or disabled 41 Japanese vessels, 2 major supply depots, and inflicted approximately 250 enemy casualties over the course of 34 days. No other pilot in the Burma theater achieved comparable results flying a liaison aircraft. His methods were never formally adopted as doctrine, though elements of his tactics influenced later light attack and counterinsurgency aviation. The Japanese never identified him by name. In intercepted communications, they referred only to the small shadow plane and increased defenses accordingly, which reduced the effectiveness of subsequent Allied attacks, but also diverted resources away from frontline combat. After the war, Ellis returned to Texas, married a schoolteacher named Helen, and worked as a crop duster and flight instructor. He rarely spoke about Burma. When asked, he would say only that he'd done his job and come home. In 1953, a military historian researching unconventional air tactics in the CBI theater tracked Ellis down and requested an interview. Ellis declined. The historian persisted, and eventually Ellis agreed to one meeting. During the conversation, the historian asked why Ellis had taken such extreme risks when he could have simply followed orders and flown safe reconnaissance missions. Ellis thought for a long moment, then said this. He'd watched too many men die because the right action wasn't taken at the right time. Someone had to try something different. It didn't matter if it was dangerous or unauthorized. It mattered that it worked. The historian asked if Ellis considered himself a hero. Ellis laughed and said no. Heroes were the men who didn't come home. He just got lucky with a toy plane and a stubborn streak. Robert Ellis died in 1991 at the age of 73. His obituary mentioned his service as an Army Air Corps pilot in World War II, but included no details about his missions. His decorations, including a Distinguished Flying Cross and 2 air medals, were stored in a box in his garage. His children didn't learn the full extent of his war record until years after his death, when a researcher unearthed mission logs and cross-referenced them with Japanese records captured during the occupation. The researcher published a brief article in a military history journal. Few people read it. Ellis's story remained obscure, buried in archives and overshadowed by the dramatic battles and famous aces that dominated popular memory. But the numbers don't lie. 11 boats sunk in a single 3-day span. 41 total targets destroyed over 5 weeks. A one-man campaign that disrupted Japanese logistics and saved countless Allied lives. Flown in an aircraft that was never meant to see combat. Ellis didn't wait for permission, didn't ask for support, and didn't stop when others called his ideas suicidal. He saw an angle nobody else noticed, that the smallest, slowest, most underestimated plane in the theater could become a weapon if flown by someone willing to ignore every rule written for his own safety. He proved that innovation doesn't require resources or authority. It requires vision, nerve, and the refusal to accept that things must be done the way they've always been done. The other pilots stopped laughing after the first week. By the second week, they were asking how he did it. By the third, some tried to follow his example. But only Ellis combined the technical skill, spatial awareness, and psychological resilience needed to fly a fabric toy into concentrated enemy fire, drop improvised explosives within feet of his own aircraft, and return home alive mission after mission. He was called reckless, crazy, and insubordinate. He was also the most effective single pilot in his sector. And when the war ended and the records were sealed, he walked away without looking back, content to let history forget him because he'd never done it for history. He did it because boats were moving, men were dying, and someone had to stop it. The months following Ellis's forced rotation to staff duty in Calcutta were among the most frustrating of his military career. He spent his days reviewing logistics reports, coordinating supply flights, and attending briefings where senior officers debated strategies that Ellis knew, from first-hand experience, would fail in the field. He watched maps being marked with planned bomber routes that would miss their targets by miles, saw reconnaissance priorities assigned to areas already abandoned by the Japanese, and listened to colonels argue about doctrine while the real war continued hundreds of miles away. At night, lying on a cot in the officers' quarters, Ellis would replay his missions in his mind, analyzing what he could have done better, which angles he'd missed, which boats had escaped. The shrapnel wounds his arm healed, leaving thin white scars that ached when monsoon rains came through. But the deeper wound, the knowledge that he could still be useful and was instead trapped behind a desk, that one never closed. Nakamura recovered from his shoulder injury and was reassigned to translation duties with an intelligence unit in New Delhi. Before he left, he visited Ellis one last time. They sat on the steps of a colonial-era building repurposed as Allied headquarters, drinking weak coffee and watching supply trucks rumble past in the equatorial heat. Nakamura said he'd been having nightmares, not about the combat, but about the silence after. The way the river looked once the boat stopped burning, the bodies floating downstream. The realization that they'd killed men who were just following orders, same as them. Ellis listened without interrupting. When Nakamura finished, Ellis told him something he'd never said out loud before. Every man he'd killed had been on his way to kill someone else. Maybe an Allied soldier, maybe a Burmese civilian, maybe a Chinese refugee. The moral calculus wasn't clean, and it wasn't supposed to be, War didn't offer clean choices. It offered necessary ones. You did what had to be done, and then you carried it. Nakamura nodded slowly, shook Ellis's hand, and walked away. They never saw each other again. Ellis's reassignment ended in late August when the squadron rotated back to combat operations. But instead of returning to liaison duties, he was assigned to train new pilots in observation and reconnaissance techniques. No mention was made of his attack missions. No formal acknowledgement appeared in his file. It was as if those 5 weeks had been erased, reduced to a statistical footnote in classified after-action summaries. Ellis taught the basics: map reading, radio procedure, visual reporting. But his heart wasn't in it. The trainees were competent but unimaginative, content to follow procedures and avoid risk. None of them looked at the Sentinel and saw potential. They saw limitations. Ellis didn't push. He'd learned that you couldn't teach someone to see angles. Either they saw them or they didn't. In September, a young reporter from Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper, arrived at the training base researching a story about unsung support roles in the Burma campaign. Someone mentioned Ellis's name, and the reporter requested an interview. Ellis agreed, assuming it would be routine. But the reporter had done his homework. He'd found references to unusual attack missions in operational logs, cross-checked them with intelligence summaries, and pieced together enough to ask pointed questions. Who modified the Sentinel? How many missions were flown? What were the results? Ellis deflected most of it, saying he'd done what needed doing and preferred to focus on the men still fighting. The reporter pressed harder, sensing a bigger story. Ellis ended the interview early, walking away mid-question. The reporter published a brief, vague article mentioning innovative reconnaissance techniques, but no specifics. Ellis never read it. By October, the war in Burma had shifted. Allied forces were advancing. Japanese logistics were collapsing, and river traffic had become sporadic and heavily defended. The window for Ellis's type of solo strikes had closed. The Japanese had adapted, moving supplies at night, dispersing convoys, and positioning anti-aircraft guns along key waterways. Ellis knew that if he tried the same tactics now, he'd be dead within 2 missions. The lesson wasn't lost on him. Innovation had a shelf life. Once the enemy adjusted, you needed a new angle. But finding that angle required freedom to experiment, and the Army didn't grant freedom. It granted orders. Ellis requested a transfer to fighter training, hoping to transition to a role with more autonomy. The request was denied. He was too valuable as an instructor, too experienced to waste on a risky retraining pipeline. The decision felt like a cage door closing. In November, Ellis received a letter from his younger brother, stationed with an infantry unit in France. The letter described brutal fighting in the Hurtgen forest, friends killed by artillery, the cold and mud, and endless fear. The brother wrote that he'd heard Ellis was safe in a training command and was grateful one of them might make a home. Ellis read the letter 3 times, then burned it in a trash barrel behind the barracks. He didn't want safety. He wanted to matter. But the war had moved on, and he was left standing still, teaching men to fly carefully when careful flying won nothing. The campaign in Burma continued through early 1945, grinding toward the eventual liberation of Rangoon. Ellis remained in training command, watching from a distance as other pilots earned decorations for missions he could have flown better. He grew quieter, more withdrawn, spending his off hours alone, sketching modifications to aircraft that would never be built and tactics that would never be used. Other officers began avoiding him, uncomfortable with his intensity and unwilling to engage with someone who'd been unofficially sidelined. Ellis didn't care. He'd stopped expecting the military to understand what he'd done or why it mattered. He focused on finishing his service and going home. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Ellis was still in India, counting days. When Japan surrendered in August, he was among the first to request discharge. The paperwork took 6 weeks. In October, he boarded a transport ship bound for San Francisco, carrying a duffel bag, a pilot's logbook, and a box of personal effects that included photographs, letters, and 3 thermite grenades he'd kept as souvenirs. Customs inspectors at the dock found the grenades and confiscated them. Ellis shrugged and said he'd forgotten they were there. The inspector gave him a hard look, but didn't file a report. Ellis walked off the dock into a country that had moved on, where nobody asked about Burma and nobody cared about toy planes. Returning to Texas felt like landing in a foreign country. The towns were the same, the landscape unchanged, but Ellis had become someone different. He moved back in with his parents temporarily, sleeping in his old room, staring at the ceiling, replaying missions in his head. His father, a man of few words, watched him carefully but said nothing. His mother tried to coax conversation, asking about his service, but Ellis gave short answers and changed the subject. He couldn't explain what it had been like to fly 30 feet above a river with bullets tearing through fabric around him. Couldn't describe the sound of thermite igniting on a wooden deck, or the smell of burning phosphorus mixing with jungle humidity. Those experiences belonged to a different world, one that had no translation into peacetime language. Ellis found work crop dusting, flying low and slow over cotton fields. The same skills he'd used in combat now repurposed for agriculture. The work was solitary, repetitive, and exactly what he needed. He didn't have to talk, didn't have to explain, didn't have to pretend the war hadn't happened. He just flew. The farmers paid cash, and Ellis saved enough to buy a used Piper Cub, which he maintained himself, working on an engine in a rented hangar, finding peace in the mechanical simplicity of bolts, fuel lines, and control cables. Flying the Cub reminded him of the Sentinel. Underpowered, unglamorous, but reliable. He liked that. Flashy machines drew attention. Reliable ones got you home. He met Helen in 1947 at a church social he'd attended only because his mother insisted. Helen taught elementary school and had a directness Ellis appreciated. She didn't ask about the war. She asked what he planned to do next. Ellis said he planned to keep flying and see where that led. Helen said that sounded reasonable and suggested they get coffee. 6 months later, they were married in a small ceremony attended by family and a handful of friends. No military personnel, no uniforms, no speeches about service. Just vows, a reception with cake, and a honeymoon driving through New Mexico in Ellis's battered Ford truck. Helen later said she knew Ellis carried something heavy, but figured he'd talk when he was ready. He never was, and she stopped waiting. They built a life around that silence, and it worked. Ellis flew crop dusting for 12 years, expanding into charter flights and flight instruction. He was patient with students, teaching them to respect the aircraft and understand that flying was about decisions, not just mechanics. He never mentioned Burma. When students asked if he'd flown in the war, he said yes and moved on. One student, a young man named Carter, pressed for details. Ellis finally said he'd flown reconnaissance and left it at that. Carter seemed disappointed, expecting stories of dogfights and heroism. Ellis said reconnaissance was the most important job in the war and the least understood. Carter didn't ask again. In 1953, the historian's visit disrupted the careful equilibrium Ellis had built. The man showed up unannounced, having tracked Ellis through military records and local inquiries. He was polite but persistent, explaining that he was documenting unconventional tactics used in the CBI theater and had found references to Ellis's missions in declassified files. He wanted to understand how a liaison pilot had achieved such results. Ellis refused the first 3 times the historian asked. On the 4th, Helen told Ellis he should talk, if only to get the man to leave. Ellis agreed to one conversation. No recording, no photographs. They sat in Ellis's hangar, the historian taking notes by hand, while Ellis described the missions in flat, factual terms. He didn't embellish, didn't dramatize, didn't claim credit beyond what the numbers showed. The historian asked why Ellis had taken such risks. Ellis said he didn't think of it as risk. He thought of it as problem-solving. The boats were a problem. He solved it. The historian asked if Ellis felt proud of what he'd done. Ellis paused, considering. He said pride wasn't the right word. Satisfaction, maybe. He'd seen a need, filled it, and moved on. That was enough. The historian asked if Ellis ever regretted it. Ellis said no. Regret required believing you'd had another choice. He hadn't. The historian left, published his article months later, and sent Ellis a copy. Ellis read it once, noted the inaccuracies, and filed it away. He never corrected the record. Accuracy didn't matter. The missions had happened, the boats had sunk, and the war had ended. What anyone wrote about it 30 years later changed nothing. Ellis continued flying into his 60s, finally retiring when arthritis made it difficult to manage the controls. He sold his Cub, closed a hangar, and spent his remaining years working in his garage, restoring old engines and helping neighbors with mechanical problems. Helen died in 1987. Ellis followed 4 years later, his heart giving out quietly one morning while he sat reading the newspaper. His children found a box of war memorabilia in the garage, medals, a logbook, faded photographs of a shot-up Sentinel with a grinning corporal standing beside it. They contacted a local veterans group, which arranged a military funeral. The service was small. A chaplain spoke about duty and sacrifice. A detail fired a rifle salute. The flag was folded and presented to Ellis's eldest daughter. She accepted it, thanking the soldiers, and later placed it on a shelf in her living room, next to a framed photograph of her father standing beside a biplane, young and unsmiling, eyes fixed on something beyond the camera. The story of Robert Ellis, the pilot who armed a toy plane and sank 11 boats alone, then 41 over 5 weeks, didn't make it into the major histories. It wasn't dramatic enough for Hollywood, wasn't tragic enough for memoirs, and wasn't controversial enough for revisionist scholarship. It existed in fragments, a brief journal article, a few declassified mission reports, scattered memories among aging veterans who'd heard rumors of that crazy liaison guy but never met him. The Japanese records, captured and translated after the war, mentioned the small aircraft attacks, but attributed them to multiple sources, unable to believe one man in one plane could cause such disruption. The truth was too improbable. But improbable doesn't mean impossible. Ellis proved that with stubbornness, skill, and a refusal to accept that observation planes were only for observing. He saw a gap between doctrine and reality, built a bridge across it using rope and scrap metal, and crossed that bridge 34 times while others watched and called him reckless. He didn't do it for glory or recognition. He did it because men were dying, and he had a way to stop some of that dying, and standing idle was an option. The calculus was simple. The execution was anything but. And when it was over, he walked away, returned to a quiet life he'd left, and never looked back. That's not the arc of a traditional war hero. It's the arc of a problem solver who happened to wear a uniform, who saw war as a series of tactical puzzles and solved them with whatever tools were available. The toy plane was just a tool. The real weapon was Ellis's mind, his ability to see angles, calculate risks, and execute plans that everyone else dismissed as impossible. That kind of thinking doesn't disappear with age. It's a way of seeing the world. Ellis carried it with him from Burma to Texas, from combat to crop dusting, from youth to old age. He never stopped looking for the angle nobody else saw. He just stopped flying into enemy fire to prove he'd found it. And maybe that's the point. Heroism isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet man in a beat-up plane, doing what needs to be done because no one else will. Sometimes it's improvisation, persistence, and a willingness to be called crazy until the results prove you were right. Sometimes it's knowing when to fight and when to walk away, when to push and when to let go. Ellis understood all of that. He lived it, survived it, and let it fade into history without complaint. The boat sank. The convoy stopped. The war moved on, and so did he.